Yep, we can kind of give them a couple of minutes, and then we'll get started. Can you guys hear me okay? Volume's good? Okay, excellent. I'm pretty loud without it, but I'll use it. Right. Well, I'm just going to talk about myself for a few minutes while everybody else kind of shows up. So I've been here a few times already. I recognize a few of you guys. My name's Nicole. I'm an audiologist at Florida Gulf Coast Hearing Center. I've been doing audiology for, since 2011. I have my doctorate in audiology, and I've been here in Florida for the last year. So the first two seminars that we had done were, the first was about hearing loss in general. The second was about ringing in the ears and about balance. So today is going to be a little different. So we're going to be doing kind of a two-part lecture. So the first is on hearing conservation. So I don't know if any of you know what that is. What we'll do is we'll talk about it and we'll give just a little bit of information. And then what we'll do is we'll roll right on into what's called auditory deprivation. And we'll give a little explanation. I've got a little, some charts and things in there. Inside of your folder is this presentation. So everything that I'm going to talk about is in there for you to take with you. We only made 25 folders today, so if somebody doesn't get one, and you want one, or you want access to all of the presentations that I've done, what we can do is we can get an email address, and I can send that out to you so you have access to it. Okay? Okay, so hearing conservation, if you've ever heard of it, is usually something that you're going to see in the workforce. So if you've ever worked a noisy job, then you probably know what OSHA is. So what we're going to talk about is noise exposure and its effect that it has on your hearing, but also how hearing protection can help. So this is going to be something I geared a little bit more towards you guys. So, you know, if you were working at Honda right now, this might be a little bit more, you know, easily interpreted. But what we're going to talk about is the things that you guys might experience or have experienced in the past and how it might be affecting you in your future. So, OSHA, does anybody know what that means? So it's the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. So they stepped in quite a few years ago because of occupational noise exposure. So, you know, your different factories, your different types of jobs like construction and things like that. And what they were seeing was this steep incline in hearing loss at a younger age. And what they basically found out was that the exposure that you were getting while you were at work was causing long-term damage to your hearing. So they stepped in and they basically created a hearing conservation program that's required at any place that calls themselves a business that has extenuating noise. So they set down quite a few rules, and those rules fall into these different categories. So each business has to provide noise monitoring. So they end up bringing in someone like myself who would go into that business and would essentially level the amount of noise that they have in their facility and determine whether or not it exceeds what's considered, you know, a standard level of noise that wouldn't cause you any hearing loss in the future. So if that came back and they said, nope, you don't pass that, you definitely have to instate these rules. So in that, they have to control their excessive noise. So, for example, my brother, he works for Honda. So he was a welder for them for 5 years. And where he worked at in that facility is excessively loud. But in order to control that, what they would do is they would separate that section, the welding section, from their main line, from all the rest of the building. So you'd have to go through a double set of doors that seal so that the sound that he's experiencing in that room doesn't leak out into the rest of the building. When he steps into that room, he has to be wearing a certain level of hearing protection. So he has to be wearing some type of earplug to prevent that noise from damaging his hearing. So that's a lot of how they control that excessive noise. What you'll also see at some facilities is they will go ahead and install foam blocking on the walls, anything to dampen the amount of noise that's coming through. So if you've ever walked into a recording studio and they have that kind of eggshell looking wall, that is to absorb some of that excessive noise so that it's not as loud. So it kind of sucks it up so not so much is there to hurt you. So like I was talking about, for him, he has to wear individually fitted hearing protection. So because the level of noise that he experiences, he can't just wear the little squishy earbuds that you stick into your ear. He had to come and see someone like myself, and we did a custom fitting. So we did an ear exam on him and then made a custom earplug to fit him so that he would have the best chances of continuing normal hearing as he could. So the next thing that they go through is they go through education and training. So that's two parts where you've got your owners and your managers going through a system of education to alert them to any issues so that they can be aware of what they should and shouldn't be doing. But the education also falls on the workers. So what we gear typically our education on is making sure that they are aware of the damage that could be there and what they could be experiencing in the future. So it's one thing to give them an earplug, and it's another thing for them to actually bring it to work and wear it. So they got to know why they're wearing it. And then we provide annual hearing tests for those employees. Dependent on the level of noise, it might actually be more than annually, just to verify that the hearing is not showing any negative effects. So sometimes if you've been at an office for 35 years and they just started this program 10 years ago, we're not going to be able to tell what happened in that time before. But if you're newer and you've been working there since OSHA got involved, then you'll have what's called a baseline. So that's them testing you before you ever step foot in their facility. So they should always have a baseline. That's the best way, because then as the years move on, we can look at your hearing test from 12 years ago compared to when you walked into the building, instead of just year to year. Because year to year, your hearing can shift typically 1 to 3 decibels, but if you have a hearing test, 10 decibels is what we consider the cutoff. So if your hearing stays within 10 decibels of what it was the year before, you're considered stable. Now, if you lost 10 decibels of hearing every year for 10 years, then you look at your baseline and we know we have a problem. So it's always important to have those. So in regards to everyone, it's always good to have a baseline hearing test. Because if anything were to happen, let's say you got an ear infection, or you perforated your eardrum, or you were standing next to the ambulance when they flipped the siren on, then you wouldn't know without a baseline if that damaged your hearing right then and there, or if it's just been something that happened gradually over time. So then we go through procedures for preventing additional hearing loss. So that's going to be where they set forth these different steps. So just like for him, he shows up to work, he has to check in, he has to clock in, then he has to go and he has to get into his uniform, then he has to go to his section, and what he does is his manager is there, and they basically ask, do you have your earplugs? And then he has to show them to him, and then he gets to go through the door. Without the earplugs, he does not get to go to work that day. So those are just little steps that they take to try and prevent that loss. And then record keeping is exactly what it sounds like. They have to keep your records and make sure that they are up to date. If they're not, then they can get in a significant amount of trouble, on top of the fact that if you developed hearing loss and you can prove that it was through your work, then you have a workers' compensation claim. And we all know that no business wants to pay for that. So, to give you a better idea, so this is more of the educational part that we usually look at to kind of explain to people how much damage can happen. So, this is just different noise levels for just handheld, everyday power tools that you could have at home, regardless of if you're a handyman or not. So what you're going to see down at this bottom is essentially the level of decibels that that sound is. So what OSHA considers the maximum volume that you can experience without wearing hearing protection and be in that environment for 8 hours of work is 85 decibels. So that line right there runs right up. So you can see everything on this list is higher than that. So if you were just using a hand drill, you can see it's kind of in the middle right here, it comes out to about 100 decibels of volume. So in regards to that, what OSHA set forth is 85 decibels. If you have less than 85 decibels of volume, then you can work in that environment for your entire shift. However, if you are in this room and it, let's say, goes up 5 decibels, so instead of being 85, you're in a 90 decibel environment. If you're in that environment, you have to take the time that you can spend in that environment and cut it in half. So where you're at 85, you can work 8 hours. If it's 90 decibels, you can only work 4 hours in that environment. Then you can see if it goes up to 95, that's 2 hours. 100 is 1 hour. So you can only be in that environment for 1 hour without hearing protection, without causing irreversible damage to your hearing. So one thing, most people don't use a drill for 1 hour, or at least 1 hour over and over and over again. But a good example for what most people experience is a lawnmower. So lawnmowers are typically anywhere between 100 and 110 decibels of volume. So if you are at 100 decibels, then you mow your lawn for an hour, you have caused damage to your hearing that can't be reversed. If it's more than that, then that's 30 minutes or 15. So really, with lawn mowing, you should be wearing hearing protection, but most people do not. So the reason that they have this kind of built in is so that they can determine whether or not and what type of hearing protection a person may or may not need in their environment. So if you're using really any of these guys up here that are less than 100, then you can just use one of those squishy little earbuds. That's fine. But if you're exceeding that 100 decibel level, you really should be wearing circumaural, the headsets that completely go over the ear and seal around the side of your head, or custom earplugs that are built specific to you. So if anybody's ever gone target shooting or anything like that, gone to the gun range, you'll see that most of the people that show up there have custom or over-the-ear hearing protection. That is the best thing for you. So This is just an example of the progression of hearing loss that somebody might experience if they had worked a noisy job. So this example is specifically for a carpenter. So at age 25, which we start right up here, you see that this dashed line is considered the limit for normal hearing. So at 25 years old, they're still in that normal range. If 10 years from then, you'll see that they have already succeeded in moving past that normal limit. Another 10 years, and you can see that they've dropped a significantly further amount. And then at 55 years old, that's a pretty big hearing loss for that person. So that's a totally untreated, no earplugs, just doing carpentry. So that's not even somebody that really does that for 10 hours a day, because you might not be using those power tools all the time. But that is just a person that has worked in that field for, 30 or 40 years. So to give you an idea of how that would compare to someone else, we've got this little graph right here. So this red guy right here is that 25-year-old carpenter. And then this one is your 55-year-old carpenter. That blue line would be a 50-year-old who had never experienced noise exposure, so worked a desk job or didn't work in a noisy environment. So you can see that a 25-year-old carpenter's hearing loss, at 25 years old is the same as somebody who might be 50 years old. And then you can just see that once they get to the same age, the significant impact that noise exposure has had on them over the course of their working career. So, we've talked about tinnitus before, so I always like to factor that in as well. So what you'll see is that if you had a non-noise exposed worker, so somebody who worked in a very quiet job, their chances of tinnitus are about 6% compared to everyone that they tested. Then when you look at somebody who has had noise exposure, their chances for tinnitus are almost 80%. So significantly higher. So most people that are going to develop tinnitus, it's either from a rapid decline in their hearing or typically exposure to noise. Now, of course, there are those 6% that have it for other reasons, but most of the time, that tinnitus is going to show up on a noise-exposed person. So whether you were in the military, you had a noisy job, you used a lot of power tools when you were young, you like to shoot off fireworks, you go to the gun range, all of those things will have a higher impact on that sound that you get. So what we kind of say is, if you're going to be exposed to noise, wear the hearing protection now or hearing aids later, because this is what normal hair cells inside of your cochlea look like. So they have that nice uniform kind of more like a V shape to them, and you can see you have nice two rows. We've got our outer hair cells and our inner hair cells. Well, this is a noise-exposed, damaged cochlea. So you can see that there are practically no hair cells left. So what's left of them are damaged, if there are any there. And so what ends up happening is we start losing our hearing, and those damaged hair cells will start sending bad signals up to your brain, which usually result in tinnitus. So they're damaged, they're sending fake signals because they're not working correctly. So that's kind of just a view of what that carpenter at 55 would be looking at. So I talked a little bit about hearing protection and kind of why and what types you would use already. So to give you an idea, again, gun range, you're going to be using these kind of over-the-ear, fully covered set of hearing protection. Those are going to be the best because they don't matter how your ear is shaped. So if you, from one person to the next, can have an ear canal that one is very narrow, one is very open. Somebody might have a collapsed ear canal. You might have a ear canal that's been surgically altered. You may have had maybe some cancer removed from your ear. So maybe your pinna, which is the kind of floppy part of your ear, maybe it doesn't look like what it used to look like. And so that has a significant impact on how well just a universal fit earbud is going to fit in your ear. So if you have a very large ear canal and you put a regular sized squishy earbud in there, by the time it expands, it may or may not completely occlude or close off your ear canal. And if it doesn't, then you might as well not even wear it, because it's basically going to let that sound right through. So these guys have absolutely no effect on that. They just go right around the side of the face, so they can make a nice seal. They're also typically going to be a little bit more noise reducing. So they can be reducing up to like 60 decibels. So if you have a TV device, a TV ears, you might have some that look not quite like that, but they can cancel out the noise around you and give you the sound you're listening for. And because they're not impacted by your ear, they can do a little bit better job. Otherwise, you're looking at this custom earpiece. So you can see that that fits her ear perfectly. So that's been created by doing an impression like you do with your teeth, and they create this earpiece to be specific to her. So there will be no leaks because it is specific. These are really only necessary for significant noise exposure. If you were doing something like using a power tool or something like that, and just for a few minutes, then those little squishy earbuds, they're going to be able to hold back about 30 decibels if they're perfectly fit. But usually 30 decibel removal from a 90 decibel environment is going to be plenty to protect your hearing. So you'd only really need these if you were doing something very, very loud. So that kind of concludes hearing conservation. And what we're going to move into is called auditory deprivation. So this is essentially going to be something that happens to that person once the hearing has shown some decrease. So, and it's not just from noise. We lose hearing naturally. And so anytime we start to have hearing loss, auditory deprivation is something that can happen to you. So we're going to talk about what it is. What is binaural summation? So I'm going to explain that to you as well. Is there proof that this exists? What's the difference between one ear and two ears? And is there any treatment for this? So, use it or lose it. That's kind of what we use as our slogan for auditory deprivation, which just means that if you have a hearing loss and it goes untreated, you're basically not using it. So over time, you're going to see that there's a decrease in your ability to clearly and distinctly understand what's being said. So, hearing loss is often very gradual, therefore auditory deprivation is also very gradual. So as the hearing shifts slowly over many, many years, what we see is that, you're not just going to wake up one day and your clarity is gone. Typically what happens is the hearing changes gradually, and then our brain makes some corrections for that to adapt to that. And then over that time of essentially not functioning or not using certain regions of your hearing, then the nerve that takes the sound from our ear up to our brain starts to show damage. So essentially, auditory deprivation is the loss of clarity and distinct sound. So if you were here for my first lecture, you saw a lot of pictures of your inner ear. So I'm going to just quickly go kind of through that apparatus again. So you have your outer ear, which is what you can physically see, that goes down to your eardrum, and that becomes your middle ear. So then you have your three middle ear bones. If you remember from school, the hammer, the anvil, and the stirrup. So those are your middle ear function. Your stirrup, which is your stapes, then goes into a little window in your cochlea. So it looks like a little snail shell. And that guy is attached to that opening, and as it moves, it pushes into the cochlea, and there's fluid in there, and it moves the fluid. The fluid moves those little hair cells we just looked at, and then those hair cells are all attached to a little neuron that becomes a nice auditory nerve. So that is our 8th cranial nerve. Its job is to take everything from our ear up to our brain for processing. If that nerve got snipped, you would hear 0. So our ear is just the mechanics. Our brain is how we hear. So essentially, that deprivation is when that nerve is no longer sending good information or correct information or enough information up to the brain to process the sound. So then we end up asking for repetition. We end up saying, huh. We're not getting that clarity that we used to get. And with the deprivation in mind, what happens is even when we turn the volume up, that nerve is sending bad information. So even with the extra volume, it doesn't clear things up. So if you've ever watched something on television and you're having a little bit of a harder time picking up what they were saying, and you turn the volume up, you might get a little bit more, but it's still not maybe as clear as you'd like it to be. And then we start moving to captions. So that is essentially how auditory deprivation works, is that we turn the volume up, but even with the extra volume, we might still not have enough to understand clearly what's been said. Or we're taking a guess, and then we might ask somebody something and they're like, is not what I was talking about. So what ends up happening is those nerves, that auditory nerve, it's a combination of all of those little hair cells moving. So usually we start losing more hearing in our high frequencies, our high pitch sounds. So music, bird chirps, things like that. And so that section of the nerve that's getting that information is getting limited information. So it sits kind of like a muscle. It's not being used. So then it starts atrophying. And then maybe 20 years later, when we go to put a hearing aid on it, or with your muscle if you started working out, it's not very comfortable. You're very tight for the first couple of days, you're sore and everything like that. But you can rework a muscle and you can bring that back. The auditory nerve, once it's gone, once it starts showing damage, you can't reverse that damage. What you can try and do is slow it down. So, auditory deprivation, I'll just give you this quick definition. Just a condition that occurs in individuals suffering from hearing loss, where the brain loses its ability to interpret words due to the lack of stimulation over a long period of time. So, this is just a little picture of how our system works. So, one ear, this is just one pathway, moves up. And what it does is it crosses over in the brain, and we actually get stimulated on both sides. So one ear stimulates both sides of our brain. So 2 ears cross over again, and you're still getting that kind of 4 times that information. So when you have 2 ears, you're always going to do better than one. You're basically getting double the amount of information. But one ear can work for you because it sends information to both sides of our auditory cortex. So if we had any type of, an injury, a concussion, anything sustained to the brain, we can live with one cortex. We do not need both, but we benefit from both. So this is where binaural summation comes in. So keep in mind, both sides is better, 2 sides are better than one. So binaural summation is essentially when you get the signal from one ear, you're going to get it, for example, let's say you're hearing a 60 decibel dog barking. So if you hear that out of one ear, let's say you plugged one ear and you heard it out of one ear, then you took the other ear and you plugged it and you heard it from the other ear, you'd hear it at about the same level of volume. But if you took both your fingers out of your ears and you listened to it with both ears, it's going to actually be louder than what it would be if you heard it just with one ear or the other. So what happens, because it crosses over in the brain and we're getting double the signal, we actually get a little bit better volume and a little bit better clarity when we have both sides functioning. So you can see the sound's coming here and it crosses over, and this sound comes over here and crosses over. So you're getting that crossover, which gives you that little bit of a boost. So to give an example, when we do our hearing test, we test your word clarity. So typically we test the clarity of one ear, and then we'll test the clarity of the other ear. So if you have a symmetric, similar hearing loss, let's say you got 75% correct on both sides when we tested one compared to the other. But when we put both ears, so if we do that same testing, but we send the signal to both ears at the same level, typically the word clarity is going to increase significantly. So it might jump from 75 all the way up to 85 or 90%, because you're getting double the signal and you're getting a little bit extra information. So the whole point to this is it's better to have two ears than it is to have one ear. So it's the same as we have two legs, we have two arms, we have two eyes, we have two nostrils, all needed. So again, to this use it or lose it, is there any truth to this? So we always wonder, how is this going to impact everybody? Because we know that with hearing, there can be a significantly different layout for everyone. Some people will go through life with no noise exposure and end up with profound hearing loss. Others will have had a significant amount of noise exposure, and they might sneak by with normal hearing. My dad's one of those. He was in Vietnam. He was shot multiple times. He was in the police department, but he has normal hearing, and my mom does not. So, sometimes it's kind of funny how that works. But what we are curious about is more so, less of if it exists and more of how it affects or impacts each person. So we ask these specific questions, over many, many years. So really over the last 40 years have they been doing this type of research to determine what's the best way to kind of attack auditory deprivation, prevent it, or at least if it's there, how to slow it down. So what we have, I just have a couple little research articles here. So there are 3 of them. I'll just quickly go over them. So the first study that was done was in 1984 by Silman and his colleagues. And what they experimented with was amplifying adults with bilateral sensorineural hearing impairment. So they didn't really find any significant changes. And what they did was they took one ear, so you have similar hearing on both sides, and they provided some of the people with 2 hearing aids and others with 1. And the ones that got 2 hearing aids didn't show any significant audiometry or audiometric change. So from one test to the next, their pure tones, the beeps, if you've ever had a hearing test when they say beep, 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 and you raise your hand, then those did not change. However, they did show significant declines in what's considered their super threshold speech discrimination. So the ones who were not amplified, basically in that unaided ear, showed a significant decrease in their word clarity. So when they did the original test, if they had 80% word understanding, the ear that had the hearing aid kept that 80%. The one that didn't have any hearing aid on that, after 3 years, showed like a 30% decline in their speech clarity. So that is a big thing. It was something that they didn't know existed before. So a lot of people, if you've ever gone to get a hearing aid, or if you know anyone with a hearing aid, the first question is, do I need 1 or do I need 2? And a lot of times we think, well, we'll just wear 1 because, we'll still get the clarity and everything will be fine. But this was a hallmark study because it basically proved that that is a bad idea. So what we know now, thanks to an additional follow-up study, was that if you left that, so the first study was for 3 years. Then what they did was they said, okay, well, let's look at these monaural completely monaural, completely binaural. So they basically followed it up with the initial test, and they just saw the same thing, that as time went on, that clarity in the unaided ear would continue to decline. So this was kind of like a follow-up study that agreed with the original study. So, you can't ever put anything into fine print unless it's been proven that it actually happens. So they even went one step further and followed up with people not just 3 years later, but also 5 years later. So they did a full 5-year study where they tested these people every year for 5 years with these hearing aids, one-sided, two-sided. And what they did in this one is they actually stepped in partway through and provided a second hearing aid for those monaural wearers to see if there was any way to restore what had been lost. And what they found on this study was that, again, that ear that went untreated showed that rapid kind of decline. And then what ended up happening was when they put that hearing aid back onto that person after X amount of years, that they maintained that clarity, but it did not come back. So if they were at 80 and they dropped down to 50, let's say, when they put the hearing aid on them, they basically stayed right around 50. So that's that use it or lose it theory. So once it's gone, it's gone. There's no way to reverse that damage. So these are just little references for those. So that's kind of morbid, once it's gone, it's gone. But there are definitely some treatment methods that we utilize to try and help when that occurs. So, we're not just going to say, oh, no, too bad, go on about your business. We use oral rehabilitation. So it's just like, if you went in for speech therapy or something like that, after something happens, it's just a different method with your hearing. So yes, we might not be able to reverse that original damage, but what we can typically do is strengthen other areas to give us some of that information back. So this little tree that we see right here is basically how we'd want to live. You want to have a nice tree. You don't want to have a tree that is dying and has branches that are falling off and things like that. So oral rehabilitation is kind of the trunk to that. So we want to have a nice, good, thick trunk, and that happens with all of these different little options. So we use communication strategies. So we've talked about that at a previous lecture. So different things that you can do to improve on your ability. So face-to-face communication, good lighting, clear speech, taking a break, enunciating your words, making sure that if you're in a room that has 100 people in it, that you step to the side, or if there's a lot of echo in the environment, you can always throw down a rug that will kind of help absorb some of that sound. So all of those are different strategies that you can use and that we teach so that you can get the best signal possible. Then we use environmental modifications. So again, that is something like putting a rug down, changing your lighting, making sure that if you go to a restaurant, you pick the best seat for you. If you're going to a lecture like this, that you get good seating, things like that. So we also, for some people, we utilize hearing devices. So not everybody's going to go into hearing aids. That's just a common factor. But hearing devices usually are going to help when we're starting to see that decrease. They're kind of stabilizing the hearing and keeping that nerve pumping full of good information instead of letting it sit idle. So we use auditory training. So you may have seen little advertisements and stuff for, memory. So you can play these little memory games to kind of help you keep your mind sharp. Well, auditory training is the same way. So we use a couple different methods. The most common one is called LACE. It's a program that you can run from home, and what it does is it provides you with just little homeworks that you do. It's on the computer. And it just helps retrain some of that information. So, they go through the way that we hear different types of sounds and making sure that, you're able to do that. So those are just little kind of like games. A lot of people won't use those. They'll use those games that they see. Memory games work just as well. So they usually give you things to look at, and you have to remember what you saw and do this and that. So it works kind of the same way. We also use heavy counseling. So it's really hard to do auditory rehabilitation on your own because there are so many factors that are involved, and what works for one person may not work for the other. So, some people who come in with balance issues, it's, maybe making it so that they strengthen their core because, the legs are too weak, so they work on strengthening the legs. But for others, it's more of an issue with room spinning, and so what would work for that other person would not work for them. So the counseling's important because it helps you kind of set goals and make sure that we're reaching those goals. And then the other things we use are visual cues. So just like with our 5 senses, when one's not acting right, the other senses kind of pick up and they start taking a little bit more of that load so that it kind of evens itself back out. So visual cues are very important for hearing. So it's kind of like when we hear something, our eyes are kind of our backup. They're our parachute. So they watch our lips. They look at how angry or happy someone is, and it helps shape the information the brain is getting so that it can make a better decision. So if you're talking to somebody and it's a noisy crowd and they're going at you, you know that they're not saying, good job, great job, you're doing excellent. They're yelling at you. So visual cues are very important when it comes to kind of your hearing in general, but especially when the hearing system is no longer functioning the way that it should be. So everybody, it's kind of funny, every time I talk to somebody, they're like, oh, I don't read lips. And I put my hand over my mouth and they're like, okay, yes, I read lips. So we all do it. It's something that we learn as children. So that's how we actually learn to talk. So we see when somebody says something, so that's why our teachers and stuff go, S like snake. So we see that movement, and that's actually how we learn to mimic and to talk. So we've used visual cues since we were toddlers. It's just natural. So this is essentially what I just went over, but on paper so that if you guys want to look at it, you can. So some of us use oral rehabilitation more heavily than others. So not every audiologist like myself will do auditory rehabilitation. So you can't just walk in and say, I want auditory rehabilitation. It doesn't work like that. But most of us do have some kind of option, or if we don't do it, we have a referral source. So if you are really struggling with your clarity, you've tried hearing aids, you've done everything that you can think to do, it's really not a bad idea to step in to either your primary care, or if you see an otolaryngologist or an ear, nose, and throat doctor. They usually work pretty heavily with us, and basically we can come up with a nice treatment option for you. So, it's not just a one-time thing. It's something that, we have to try, and if it doesn't work, then we have to we have to reassess and kind of manipulate that program. But again, it's going to heavily talk about how if you are experiencing these issues and you have a hearing loss, but you don't wear hearing aids or you've never worn hearing aids, that essentially a hearing aid, or depending on the type of loss, a different device like a Baha or a cochlear implant, are going to typically be the first step in that program. So once they've kind of figured out what the hearing and what's going on, and if a hearing aid would be helpful for you, a hearing aid is usually kind of that next step. So not everybody's going to go that route, like I said, but most of the time, I just don't want you to be surprised if you go in and ask somebody and they say, oh, you just need hearing aids. Yeah, that's usually the first step. So we use what's called a needs assessment. So that's how we prioritize or train that specific person. So everyone, like I said, is different. So a needs assessment just breaks down your specific handicaps. So what's happening specific to you, not just everybody. So some person might have no issue in one-on-one, but when they get into a crowd, they have a lot of trouble. But another person might do, perfectly fine in a crowd, but, when they get home and they're in one room and their significant other's in the other, then we're arguing all the time. So everybody's a little different. Some people like to do a lot of social activities, some people don't. My mom's a social butterfly, my dad's a hermit. So they would have totally different rehabilitation style for them. So that needs assessment is very important because it helps us better determine what to do for you. So it also requires active participation. So, we do a lot of follow-ups. We do a lot of, unfortunately, there are a lot of goals meetings and having you fill out different kind of questionnaires and things, and we redo those because what we look at is when we filled out the questionnaire the first time, and it's rated from I do very poorly or I do very good, and then we look at it as we move through that treatment, we're looking to see if there's positive reinforcement, if there's something is changing. If nothing is changing, if you're reporting the same thing every time we see you, then we know that we're not meeting that expectation and we need to change what we're doing. So we then make a hearing management plan. So that is just specifically after we've done your needs assessment. So what we do is we look at those behavioral steps. So if you're somebody who gets frustrated really easily, we might institute like a meditation into your day, going to a yoga class, something to kind of help you de-stress. So stress is a big thing. If we're really stressed out, then we have a hard time concentrating, and if we already have trouble hearing and we can't concentrate, then that's going to make it even harder. So some of those steps are just to kind of help in your environment and just your day-to-day activities. So we'll also look at technology. So again, if you have a pair of hearing aids and you're doing great in one-on-one, but you're doing really badly at restaurants and things like that, we might look at what's called a Roger pen or a streaming device that would make that noise situation a little bit easier for you. We look at preventative steps such as, giving you lists of restaurants that are pretty quiet, that have good seating, places that you can go that you won't have to worry so much about the environment. So we can provide those for you. Restorative steps. So that is, if you're having trouble, instead of sitting there and getting frustrated, the restorative steps are essentially to help you relax. So the example here is if you're at a noisy party and you're not hearing anyone and now you're frustrated, just get up and leave. Go home, relax, try it again. So we also, like I said, we use LACE, which is just a restorative internet program. So that's one of those guys where you're just doing that at home on your own. It just provides you with different listening environments that you can control and try, at home. And if you're not doing well, you can always step away from it instead of telling you to go to this restaurant and buy a dinner but then not enjoy it. This is something where you can basically reproduce the restaurant environment from the luxury of your own home. And then the working with a professional is just that face-to-face counseling that we typically do. So we provide all of this kind of in that counseling package. So that's just kind of how we manipulate that rehabilitation to help with that deprivation. So that is all. Thank you. So if anybody has any questions, I always put this up here. You're free to ask me. If you don't want to ask in front of everybody, I'll be here for the next probably 20 minutes just to answer any private questions. We also can call me or email me. And in your folder is my card with that number and email on it. So does anybody have any questions? Excellent. Yes. So it's not so much that we like it, because I will not go to a restaurant like that. I love Cracker Barrel, but I will not eat there because it's very noisy. So most of it is actually not that they're trying to make it noisy, but a lot of it's cost. So, you know, when a restaurant opens, it's much more expensive for them to buy, you know, the high-backed booths. It's more expensive for them to kind of create different sections. You know, carpet's much cheaper than tile and wood floors. So a lot of it is also, you know, they're trying to get their overhead, so they're going to cram more people and more chairs and more tables in to bring in more money than they would, you know, if they were trying to make us happy, they would space us out a little bit more. So it's not so much that. I mean, they're your bar type scenes, which are geared more towards your younger crowd, and that's if they're going to listen to music or something like that. I have not ever felt happy in that environment, mostly because of my job. I'm like, no, these are my money makers. So what happens is usually not so much that the restaurant is trying to do that, but a lot of them just take over a building that is empty and, you know, switch it up a little bit. But there are certain restaurants that do, in my opinion, a little bit of a better job. Well, Bob Evans is one of them, actually. So if you walk into a Bob Evans, where you would go to check in is usually on the other side of the wall from where all of the people are eating. But they have typically 3 sections. So instead of everybody being in the same room, they have 3 separate sections. So if you have trouble, you can always ask to be seated in one of the smaller sections. So certain restaurants, especially ones that do any type of catering events or anything like that, are going to have a room like that where, you know, unless it's being catered, they let people sit in it, and that is going to be, you know, maybe 10 people in that room instead of 75. So different things like that. Carpet in restaurants, although I think it's kind of gross, is actually better for you because it makes the sound that's happening around you get absorbed by that carpet, whereas if you're in a tile or a wood floor, all that sound bounces around. But again, carpet's harder to clean if somebody spills something. So a lot of restaurants use tile or wood floors just because it's easier to maintain. They don't have to replace it as often. So again, it's not usually that they're trying to make us. Yeah, so right. So a lot of them do have some of those features where they'll, whatever kind of decorations that they put on the wall, you might notice that they're more of a material. So like a lot of times how people like tapestries work really well because they absorb some of that little bit of sound. It's really just challenging because usually wait staff, they don't have a person for each table, so they're kind of lumping you all together. Places like steakhouses have a tendency to have the higher backed booths. So if you walk into a restaurant and it has a booth that when you sit down, it's higher than your head, it's usually going to be an excellent place because that booth is blocking out all of the sound behind you in the restaurant. So, you know, diners have a tendency, you're all in one, all in one room and the booths are kind of low backed. So, you know, in the presentation, so, sure. Yep, I'm done, almost. So I'm just going to say, there's a mobile app if you have a smartphone called I Hear You, and it has places that have been deemed hearing loss friendly on it. So that was just it. That's all I was looking for. You are welcome.